This video was sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and it's Wednesday, so that means it's time for another deck history video. In this series, I look at the history of deck archetypes that have been successful at Magic's highest level of competition, starting from the first time the deck emerged, and ending with the modern day. As usual, I ran a poll last week to allow the viewers decide this week's topic, and Bogles decks were far and away the winner. Now, as you can see on this poll, this video is not just about the modern Bogles deck, a deck that looks to play Slippery Bogle and other hexproof creatures and slap auras on them. I went with that name in the poll and for this video because people tend to know that deck pretty well these days, but Bogles is but one version of a type of deck that has been around in Magic for around 13 years. This video will look in general at these aura hexproof decks that seek to put a bunch of auras on a difficult to kill creature. Auras are cool because they can make your creatures really big, but they typically aren't that good because of the serious risk of getting 2-for-1'd. But if you put auras on creatures with hexproof or protection from key colors or indestructibility, well, then you're just getting all the upside that an aura can give you without much downside. That's the basic principle that all the decks in this video are based around. At one time or another, aura hexproof decks have found success in Extended, Standard, Historic, Pioneer, and Modern, and in this video we'll talk about the origins of each of these decks, as well as how and why they've changed over time. We're going to begin with Extended, where we can find the earliest deck utilizing this strategy. This deck was piloted by Matt Hansen to a top 8 finish at Grand Prix Philadelphia in 2008. The deck wasn't quite as all in on the aura strategy of later decks, but this deck is definitely a precursor to the aura hexproof decks that would emerge later. Now, this deck was not called aura hexproof. In fact, hexproof wasn't even a word in Magic at this point. While the ability that became hexproof first appeared in the mid-2000s, it only became an official keyword in 2011. For that matter, the word aura had only been around in Magic for about 3 years at this point. However, the deck is really built around enchantments and auras and Tallowisp in particular. That's where the spirit part of Spirit Stompy comes from. The deck played lots of hard-to-kill creatures, including Troll Ascetic, who had the ability that would become hexproof, as well as regeneration, both of which go quite well with auras. Other hard-to-deal-with creatures in the deck were Phantom Centaur and Chameleon Colossus, whose protection made them a real problem in a format loaded up with black decks. One of the game's primary game plans was to get one of those creatures in play, and then slap Armadillo Cloak or Griffin Guide on it, at which point the opponent could do very little to interact. This deck's success was kind of a one-time thing, but it was definitely a portent of things to come, and really, the first time people discovered the difficulties of a hexproof creature with an aura on it. There wouldn't be another deck like it before Extended ended in 2011, and it would take a few years for another deck with this type of strategy to emerge, but emerge it did in the Standard of 2013. Where Josh Utter-Leyton and John Stern both piloted Bant hexproof decks to top 8 finishes, with John Stern even winning the event. Hexproof was now officially a keyword, and the deck ran 2 formidable creatures who had it. One of them was Geist of St. Traft, who also made a 4/4 attacking angel every time it attacked, so buffing him enough to survive combat was a real problem for your opponent. The other was Invisible Stalker, which, in addition to having hexproof, was also unblockable. This makes it one of the hardest creatures to interact with in the entire game. The game's main plan was to get one of these down and enhance it, mostly with auras like Ethereal Armor, Rancor, or Spectral Flight. Ethereal Armor loved other auras, so it was a perfect fit in the deck, given that it gave a massive stats boost for only a single mana. Rancor gave +2/+0 and trample, and even if they did kill the creature that it was on, you would get Rancor back. And Spectral Flight gave both flying and +2/+2 for a pretty cheap cost. It is worth noting that the deck also used a couple of other means to enhance hexproof creatures, namely increasing Savagery and Silverblade Paladin. Later versions of the deck would be much less interested in these 2 cards and more interested in going crazy with even more auras. Hexproof decks would go on to be one of the most dominant decks of the Standard of 2013. Valentine Mackel was the next to pilot a Bant hexproof deck to a top 8 finish, which he did at Grand Prix Miami that year. His version of the deck had a few differences from the one that top 8'd Grand Prix Atlantic City earlier that year. He still ran the key hexproof creatures of Geist and Invisible Stalker, but he also added a few more creatures, perhaps most notably Voice of Resurgence. It doesn't have hexproof, but it has an ability that really mitigates against a 2-for-1 risk of putting an aura on it, since it would make a creature token anytime it died or your opponent cast a spell during your turn. He also added a new enchantment to the mix, Unflinching Courage, which was pretty much identical to Armadillo Cloak, which we saw appeared in the extended version of Aura Hexproof. Trample and Lifelink are a tough thing to overcome in a race, especially when it's being added to hexproof creatures who are unblockable or making a 4/4 angel every time they attack. About a month later, Gavin Bennett also piloted a Bant hexproof deck to a top 8 finish, in this case at Grand Prix Calgary. The basic game plan of the deck remained the same, and he kept all the same auras that Valentin Mackel had. But he added a couple of newly legal and standard creatures to the mix: Fiendslayer Paladin and Gladecover Scout. The Paladin came with keywords that paired really well with auras, and more importantly, he couldn't be targeted by black or red spells, which made him very difficult to kill. So it isn't hexproof, but it's a pretty good substitute for it. Gladecover Scout, meanwhile, did have hexproof, and could come down on turn 1, a turn earlier than the Stalker, and 2 turns earlier than Geist. Playing the Scout on turn 1 and sticking a Spectral Flight on it on turn 2 could sometimes just mean game over for your opponent. Hexproof decks would continue to perform well in Standard for the remainder of 2013 without the deck undergoing any more major changes. And in September of 2013, Innistrad Block rotated out of Standard, and that meant the deck lost Geist and Invisible Stalker, and there wasn't anything comparable to replace them with. So that marked the end of Aura Hexproof decks in Standard, but we have plenty more to talk about. Let's move now to Modern. The Modern format was created in 2011 and replaced Extended. It's a non-rotating format that features all cards printed from 8th edition to today. Aura Hexproof decks emerged there in 2013 as well, in this case at the World Championship, where Reduke piloted such a deck to a 2nd place finish. Obviously, Modern has a larger card pool, and that made Reed's deck significantly different than the Aura Hexproof decks we saw in Standard at around the same time. His version of the deck really focused in on 1 and 2 drops with Hexproof. Gladecover Scout, which we've already seen, and Slippery Bogle were included. The plan was, of course, to put a bunch of auras on these creatures, and Reed ran a much larger suite of enchantments than the standard version of the deck did. He, of course, utilized Rancor and Ethereal Armor and Unflinching Courage, but in Modern, he also had access to Daybreak Coronet, an enchantment that gives a crazy good boost, but only works if there's another aura on the creature. He also had access to Hyena Umbra and Spider Umbra, which came with Totem Armor, which made the hexproof creatures even harder to kill. The deck also made sure to keep ripping through the library so that there would always be at least one enormous hard-to-kill threat on the table. Core Spirit Dancer and Keen Sense helped with that. The Spirit Dancer, of course, doesn't have hexproof, but she does get absolutely massive if you pile auras onto her, and that can win you the game quickly, in addition to the fact that she draws you a card every single time you play an aura. Meanwhile, Keen Sense lets you draw a card anytime your creature does combat damage to the opponent. Reed's version of the deck would go on to be the template that most later Aura Hexproof decks followed in Modern. There would be changes over the next several years, of course, but the shift towards cheaper hexproof creatures and more auras would be something that would stick around. That said, despite the success it found in 2013, another hexproof deck didn't top 8 Modern until 2015, when hexproof auras had a pretty great year. By this point, the deck's name had shifted towards the Bogles name that we all know today. Daniel Ward was the first to top 8 a premier event with the deck in 2015, which he did at Grand Prix Vancouver. The Bogles decks of 2015 weren't that different from what Reed Duke had sleeved up a couple years earlier. The two different cards in Daniel's deck were Spellskite and Spirit Mantle. Spellskite gave you a way to more effectively protect the Spirit Dancer. It could also redirect damaging burn spells to itself, or even a naturalize effect trying to blow up one of your enchantments. Spirit Mantle provided another powerful aura for the deck. Blocking Slippery Bogle or Gladecover Scout was pretty much the only way to interact with them, and Spirit Mantle made that impossible, so it was a nice addition. For the remainder of 2015, decks pretty identical to Daniel's top 8'd several more events, including the World Championship. Bogle's decks didn't undergo another significant change until 2018, when the very same Daniel Ward piloted the deck to another top 8 finish, this time at Grand Prix Toronto. Also, how funny is it that a guy who top 8'd with Bogles twice in Modern has the last name Ward, since, Ward is a recently introduced keyword ability that has a hexproof-like effect. Anyway, this time, Ward's deck ran the same creatures and most of the same auras, but there were a couple of notable additions here. One of them was Griff's Boon. While it wasn't quite additional copies of Rancor, it did a pretty good impression since it gave a stats boost and evasion and could come back from the graveyard. The main deck also featured Leyline of Sanctity. This was the result of two things. One of these was that it countered burn decks, which were quite powerful at the time, and the other was that the main weakness that Bogles decks had are edict effects. These decks like to stick all their auras on one hexproof creature, which is a pretty good strategy, but edict effects don't target creatures, and thus they have to sacrifice a creature when the player is targeted, and Leyline kept that from happening. Later in 2018, Bogles underwent another minor change. Jonathan Sharp piloted the deck to a top 8 finish at Grand Prix Hartford, and he added Cartouche of Solidarity to the mix, a 1-mana aura that grants a pretty solid boost and adds 1/1 to the table, giving you a body that can be sacrificed to an edict effect if necessary, and one that can be suited up with auras if you don't have another option. The most recent versions of the deck haven't changed a whole lot, as you can see from this deck that top-8'd the Magic Online Modern Championship. The main differences are that Leyline of Sanctity is no longer a main deck card and Cartouche of Solidarity is no longer included either. However, the auras and creatures that the deck utilized are all those we've seen already, apart from Spirit Link, which gives the deck another cheap aura, and because of how it works, you can actually stack it with other instances of lifelink to gain even more life, making it even harder for aggro decks to race you. Modern is the format where Aura Hexproof decks have been successful for the longest, but there are two newer formats that have also featured Aura Hexproof decks in the very recent past, Pioneer and Historic. Let's start with Pioneer, since it would be the next format chronologically, where we'd see a deck utilizing this strategy. Pioneer is a non-rotating format that features all sets from Return to Ravnica forward, so it has a much smaller card pool than Modern, and as a result, Pioneer Aura decks are substantially different. For one thing, these decks don't actually run any cards with Hexproof, but the basic strategy is the same, as you can see in Ken Yukihiro's deck, which he top-8'd Pro Tour Nagoya with in 2020. SRAM Senior Edificer is perhaps the most key card for the deck. In fact, these decks just tend to be called SRAM Auras. SRAM is a lot like Core Spirit Dancer. He draws you a card every time you play an aura, and that alone is enough to offset many risks. The deck also runs Alseid of Life's Bounty and Karametra's Blessing, both of which can be used to protect one of your enchanted creatures, and Hateful Eidolon, which lets you draw cards when creatures you have enchanted go to the graveyard. The deck also runs 2 enchantments that can return from the graveyard in Griff's Boon and Sentinel's Eyes. Among the other auras that this deck runs are Cartouche of Solidarity and Ethereal Armor, which we've already seen, and the deck also utilizes All That Glitters, which gives you another Ethereal Armor-like effect. The deck hasn't changed a whole lot since early 2020. Matthew Vook piloted the deck to a top 8 at the Magic Online Championship, and the only major addition to the deck was Stone Coil Serpent, which gives you another hard-to-kill creature thanks to its protection. Another notable thing about the deck is that it can utilize the companion Lurrus of the Dream Den, which allows you to cast pretty much all the permanents in the deck from the graveyard. Let's move now to Historic, the format where an aura deck has most recently found success. Historic is a Magic Arena only format, one in which all the cards in Magic Arena are legal, except for the ones that are banned, of course. This creates a unique card pool, since Arena has more recently released sets, but also a few remastered sets and special Historic anthologies that they release that have cards printed in them with the express purpose of impacting this Historic format. 2 Orzhov decks top-8'd the Kaldheim Championship earlier this year, with Arn Huschenbeth's deck winning the event. The deck runs a bunch of creatures we've already seen, between SRAM, Core Spirit Dancer, and Hateful Eidolon. This means that the deck is completely all in on the idea that drawing cards offsets the risks of auras, as it still runs a bunch of them to slap on creatures, including All That Glitters, Cartouche of Solidarity, Sentinel's Eyes, and Angelic Gift. One unique thing about this version of the deck is it's a little more controlling, running hand disruption like Thoughtseize, as well as enchantment-based removal spells like Deadweight and Mire's Grasp. The most recent version of Historic Auras hasn't top-8'd any major events yet, but it seems primed to do so at some point soon. So we'll close our discussion of Historic Auras with a look at that deck. Jose Cabezas played an Azorius Auras deck at the Strixhaven Championship. This version of the deck runs more creatures, including the difficult-to-kill Adanto Vanguard, who is a great creature to put auras on, thanks to its ability to become indestructible. Selfless Savior can also be used to protect whatever creature is wearing the auras. The deck adds blue primarily to gain access to Staggering Insight, a powerful aura that draws you cards and gains you life. The deck also makes use of Arcane Flight, which gives a nice boost in keyword for its cost. So that's a history of Bogles and other decks like it. As we've seen, there's a fair bit of difference between these decks in different formats, but they all have the same goal: abuse auras as much as possible by offsetting the risk of getting 2-for-1. This can be done with Hexproof, but also various ways to draw cards and indestructibility, among other things. Aura decks are going to continue to be relevant in multiple Magic formats going forward. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future episodes of this series, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to catch up on old episodes, and there's a lot of them, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Also, don't forget to vote in the poll to decide what deck I look at in next week's video. Thanks for watching.